Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, September 15th, 2020. Thanks to all of our audience for joining us via Zoom today, and a special thanks to our presenters who are joining us from various alternative locations because of the limited access to some buildings on campus. I'm Kenton Bird, and it's my pleasure to co-coordinate this series with Dan Buckvich from the Lionel Hampton School of Music, who is shown as Dan's iPad on your screen. We're up to 26 participants, so I think we can begin. Before introducing today's program, let me tell you about next week as we continue the theme of adapting to life in a pandemic. Our topic is pandemic pedagogy in the performing arts. How's that for a triple P alliteration? With perspectives from dance, music, and theater, featuring Robert Casely from Theater Arts, Melanie Meenan from Movement Sciences Dance Program, and Vanessa Seelert from the Lionel Hampton School of Music. And she'll be describing some of the activities that our music students and faculty, including Professor Buckvich, have been doing this semester. We'll learn a little bit more about the challenges of teaching, rehearsing, and performing in an era where social distancing is the norm, at least for this semester. Today, however, as you see on your screen, we have 5 faculty members representing 4 different disciplines. We have a philosopher, a mathematician, 2 political scientists, and a biologist. And so I think we are close to achieving Michael O'Rourke's original goal for this series of having faculty from across the university from a variety of disciplines who come together to collaborate and bring the best of those disciplines together to help us better understand an issue or a scientific problem or a contemporary challenge. And to kick off today's presentation, we'll start with the first name alphabetically is Professor Bert Baumgaertner from the Department of Politics and Philosophy here at the University of Idaho. And I would encourage the audience to put questions in the chat as we go forward. And once Bert and any other collaborators have finished presenting, we'll turn to those questions. So Bert, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Kenton. Are we good? You can hear me now? Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so thank you very much for that introduction. I am going to just briefly introduce the other people who are part of this research. I'm also pleased to say that we just found out that this research that I'm going to be presenting on today was formally accepted in PLOS Medicine. So we expect that to be published in hopefully a couple of weeks. They're usually pretty quick with the production, so we're quite pleased with that. This is about a year, at least a year of work in the making. So we're pleased that this is now finished. So the other people on here that contributed to this work was Ben Ridenhour in mathematics and statistics here at the University of Idaho. Florian Justwan, who's also in the Department of Politics and Philosophy, who is also joining us today. Juliet Carlisle, who was formerly here in the Department of Politics and Philosophy, and who is now in political science at the University of Utah. And then Craig Miller, who is in the biological sciences, also here at the University of Idaho. And many of us have been, in one form or another, quite heavily involved in what was formerly known as the Center for Modeling Complex Interactions, and that is now IMSI. And so a big shout out and thank you for all of their support there. Okay, so the title of both this talk and the paper is Risk of Disease and Willingness to Vaccinate in the United States. So our interest in this work was trying to understand what is sometimes called vaccine hesitancy. So we often, or sometimes this gets represented, right, as some type of spectrum where people will either, on the one hand, refuse to get vaccinated, or on the other hand, accept. And the spectrum sort of hides a bunch of different kinds of complications. One of those complications is that people will sometimes make different decisions for different types of vaccines. So while they might be leaning towards the refuse side for something like the flu vaccine, they might lean towards the accept side when it comes to something like the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. In addition to that type of complication, that people make decisions often on a case-by-case basis with the vaccine, as well as what the current sort of risk of the disease is, we often will break down that decision-making process into three different components that you can see here on the bottom. So there is, on the one hand, considerations related to convenience about a vaccine. So is it easy for me to go get it? Is it like low cost, or do I have to go through some insurance policy? So there's questions about the convenience. There's also considerations about the confidence. So how trustworthy is the recommendation of my family doctor, as opposed to how much trust do I place in a medical institution like the CDC? In addition to not just the how much trust someone places in the recommendations, there's also confidence in the scientific information about the side effects of the vaccine, as well as confidence in the information that people are getting about the prevalence of a disease. In some previous work that we've done with Florian and Juliet, we did some work on the nature of trust and political ideology on willingness to vaccinate. And here, right, the idea of trust is tightly connected to this notion of confidence in this circle down here. So for this research project, we wanted to hold as fixed as possible people's confidence and whatever their level of convenience or considerations about convenience. And we wanted to focus on this third component, which is called complacency. So as time has gone on, since the introduction of the measles vaccine, the number of cases of measles dropped dramatically. And complacency is this idea that, well, look, if the disease has been effectively eradicated, there really is not much of a threat anymore, which undermines the sort of push towards getting a vaccine for which the disease is no longer around. So this is the idea of complacency, is that once we've gotten rid of the threat of the disease, the motivation or the incentive to then go get vaccinated decreases. So what we were interested in here is whether the reemergence of a disease or the threat of a potential new disease would change people's complacency, right? Whether the threat or the increase in risk would motivate people who might have become a little bit more vaccine hesitant, right? So they're starting to lean more towards the spectrum of the, lean more towards the refuse side of the spectrum, whether that would shift them towards the accept side of the spectrum. So that's the main idea that we're interested in this research project. And what we did is, we call this vaccine propensity, right? So the idea is thinking that if you have a dial that represents risk, and you move that dial so that you increase risk, how much of that change in risk would correspond to a change in the propensity to go get vaccinated, right? The change in the decision to then potentially adopt the idea to get vaccinated. So that was the main sort of idea here that we wanted to test and look into. So what we did was we developed an original survey instrument where we presented 7 vaccine-preventable new diseases. Now, this was in 2018. We had no idea that COVID was coming, and I'll say a little bit about that afterwards. I'll wait till the end to say something about this. So keep in mind, this was in 2018, before we knew that COVID was coming. We presented these to each individual, one of these 7 preventable diseases. We presented the survey to a demographically diverse sample data of the US. The ultimate sample size that we then used for analysis was 2,411, but I believe we had about 3,007 surveys completed. The survey was conducted online between January 25th and February 2nd in 2018, and it came in 3 parts. So the first part of the survey, we collected information concerning the places that participants live and visit in a typical week. And one of the reasons why we did that was we wanted to sort of keep track of information about whether people live in a rural area or in an urban area, and not just whether they live there, but also where they might go visit. So we wanted to take into account some information about people's commuting patterns and whether that makes a difference. The second part of the survey then, participants were presented with one of the 7 hypothetical disease outbreaks and asked how they would respond to that, and I'll go into a lot more detail about what that looks like in a moment. The third part of the survey then, we collected a bunch of sociodemographic information. So, as sort of an overview, we had a mean age of 43, 47% were male, 43% were female. We had 38% with a college degree, and 24% were non-white. So in order to get at the dependent variable that we're interested in, right, I said that we had told survey respondents that a new disease or a disease has been discovered in the United States, and that coming into contact with an infected individual has a 25% chance of contracting the disease. Now, we recognize 25% is quite high. And that number, we might pick a different number now with the presence of COVID. But the number here is actually much less important than what our intention was, which is to hold fixed the perceived infectivity. We didn't want that to be the thing that people vary in their mind when we ask the main question. We also told participants that disease causes a number of different symptoms, including fever, diarrhea, vomiting, severe stomach pain, headaches, and dizziness. In addition to being told what the infectivity was and some of the symptoms, we wanted to control for how long or some aspect of the severity of the disease. So what we did was we randomized the sample into 7 even-sized groups, and we informed the participants about some specific dangers that are associated with the infection. So one of the groups read that people who contract the disease are sick for 1 to 3 days, too sick to work, go to school, care for others, or leave the house. Now, just to be sure that 1 to 3 days, maybe that's not a big deal. For some people, maybe they think to themselves, hey, that's great, I can binge some Netflix at home. 1 to 3 days is not such a bad deal, or not a big deal. We also made sure that we provided some additional timelines. So we gave to 3 other groups the same condition, but then we said it would last 4 to 7 days. Another group we were told 8 to 14 days. And then the 4th group, we then said more than 15 days. So here, right, we're trying to make sure that we didn't know beforehand how much we would need to tell people in order to get some type of signal. And so we provided a range of these 4 specific subgroups. And then the final 3 groups of the 7, we looked at mortality information. So instead of just being told for how long they would be sick, we told them that the illness could potentially be lethal, and we gave them, each of those 3 groups, we gave them different levels. So one of them we said it was 1 in 1,000 people, another we said 1 in 100, and finally in the highest risk group we said 1 in 10. So after reading one of those severity cues, respondents then learned that there was a highly protective vaccine with minimal chances of side effects, and that it is recommended and available to them locally at no cost. Right? So here what we're doing is trying to provide enough information so that individuals will hold fixed or have some idea of the convenience component in mind, as well as the confidence component. So with all those things sort of being held fixed and that information being provided, right, now what we tried to do was have the survey question that is tapping into our main dependent variable, which is vaccine propensity, right? That's the one thing that we're hoping to have isolated that they might then be able to change or be flexible in. So what we did is we asked each respondent how many people in your local community would have to get infected with this disease in order for them to get vaccinated. And we gave them the following answer options. One was, it would take no one to get infected. right? So what that means is the disease doesn't have to be here in my community. I will just get vaccinated for this disease. Then the other options were 1 person needs to be infected, 10 people, 100 other, and then they had the option of writing in a number. 6 was they will not get vaccinated for the disease. So here the idea is no matter how high the number of cases are in my local community, I just won't get vaccinated. And then 7 is I don't know. So we had only 45 people answer the other category, right, where they wrote in their own number. We had 395 answer I don't know, and we had 160 that did not answer the question at all. So it wasn't a required question to complete the survey. These numbers are relatively low of the 3,007 surveys that we had, so we omitted those from the analyses that I'll be presenting today. So the final dependent variable then has 5 distinct categories. Right? It starts with 1, right? I will get vaccinated even if no one in my local community is infected. It increases then to 1 person in my community is infected, 10 people, 100, and then I will not vaccinate for this disease. So we can think of 1 and 6 as sort of endpoints on a spectrum, and then the in-between categories, right, as sort of dialing up the risk. For our independent variables, we asked questions and related to the following. So we asked about race, age, sex, income, education, population size of a respondent's hometown, population sizes of all the cities commuted to during a typical week, number of children, the age of the youngest child if they had children, political ideology, religious affiliation, religiosity, where that can be measured in 2 different ways. 1, how important, the importance that they place in religion, and 2, the frequency of attending religious services. And then finally, also the self-reported health of the respondent. Only respondents that answered all of the questions pertaining to all the independent and dependent variables were then included in our analyses, and so that final sample size ended up being 2,411 individuals. Okay, so let me give you an overview of the results, and then I'll go into more detail for some of the ones that I want to highlight. So these are the ones that we found to be significant. So they included political leaning, scenario, and what we mean by scenario here is whether the individual or participant was presented with mortality information rather than morbidity information. And sort of as a brief highlight, we did not find a significant difference between levels. So whether someone was presented with the 1 to 3 days of being sick or 4 to 8 days was not statistically significant. But we did find a statistically significant difference between the mortality categories and the morbidity categories. We also found to be statistically significant age, sex, income, and then the number of local cases. That was sort of our primary thing of interest, and I'll spend a fair bit of time talking about that later. We also then had some interactions between political leaning and local cases, and you'll see that local cases ends up interacting with a bunch of the features that we've already seen, right, like the scenario, and age ended up interacting with a handful of other variables. What was not statistically significant. Now, I think this is interesting to sort of point out because one might think that these things might play a role, but at least in our analysis and in our sample and having the threshold that we picked, these did not turn out to be significant. They included religion, religious importance, frequency of attending religious service, hometown size, or the size of the largest city commuted to, which I think was a bit surprising to us. We thought that maybe something about the size of the community might matter. Race, whether an individual had children or children at home, an individual's health, and the individual's educational attainment. Okay, so let me show some of these variables in more detail. So let me start with income. What you'll see here on the left side on the y-axis is the proportion of people who are willing to vaccinate. So we start from 0 going up to 1, right? So that's either nobody up to everyone. And on the x-axis here, we have 4 different income levels. So this is below $30,000, 30 to 60,000, 60 to 90,000, and then above 90,000. Now they are relatively similar. The only one that came out statistically significant is the above 90,000. There's something interesting about this in that in other research, what is typically found is that disposition or willingness to vaccinate tends to be highest somewhere around the 30 and 40,000 mark. And there's a variety of different interpretations or hypotheses about why that might be the case. One example is that those in lower income brackets simply can't afford it, or they want to put their money towards other things. And those in higher income brackets might think something like they have other types of mitigation strategies that they can engage in, right? They could pull their children from school, for example, or do something else. In our case, we try to present the information as only being as vaccination being the only type of solution, but there's only so much that we could actually do with that survey data. So that's one potential interpretation, but we hesitate to sort of draw any sort of firm conclusions about this, other than it looks like in our data that those who make households that make above 90,000 have the highest proportion of that are willing to vaccinate. With respect to age and gender, we see that for younger participants, that the difference between male and female is very small or negligent. That's to say, there's about just below 75% would be willing to seek vaccination. What's interesting is that typically women tend to be more risk averse than men, but we actually find the opposite in our data. So as you can see, somewhere around age 50 up to about 70, right? There will be a higher proportion of men that are willing to vaccinate than there are women. And then as you get to the upper end, 80 and plus, the overlap, there's a bit of an overlap there, right? So we lose a little bit of that statistical significance. So there's a few interpretations of what's going on here. One possibility is that men in general have higher mortality rates at the older end of the spectrum. And so it might be that men are more conscious of that. And so that's why they're more willing to seek vaccination, right? So they're being a little more risk averse. Another possible interpretation is that women may be more sensitive or weight higher the concern about vaccine safety. And so there is some literature out there that vaccine safety is something that is more salient to women than it is to men. And if that's right, that would be counterbalancing. So the willingness to get vaccinated would actually be slightly lower because they're a little bit worried about the potential side effects of the vaccine. And so that might be another explanation for why, in our data, women, especially those between the age of 50 and 70, are actually less likely to seek vaccination than men. When we when we look at the case of age and the type of scenario that were presented, right? So we had the four different groups that were presented with the morbidity information, and then 3 different groups that were presented with the mortality information. We see that for younger populations, that ends up making a difference. And specifically, that when presented with mortality information, that prompts people to be more willing to engage in vaccination. Whereas if you're presented with morbidity information, that there's fewer people who are willing to engage in vaccination or willing to seek it out. Once we reach a sufficiently high, sufficiently older population, then that difference no longer matters. And I think this makes some intuitive sense, right? On the one hand, you just might not getting sick at all. And so it doesn't matter if there's a danger of morbidity or mortality. you're just as likely to seek a vaccination. Another way we might think about this is that when you're reading information about morbidity, right, so how long you might be sick, you might also right away be thinking about what the chances are of mortality as a result, right? So you might be using morbidity information as a substitute for thinking about mortality risk. Okay. And then the other case that we looked at with age and what it interacted with was the number of local cases. So again, here the idea is that we can sort of increase the number of cases to see at what point people would be willing to get vaccinated. So if we look at the case of 100 local cases, we see that the proportion that are willing to seek vaccination is relatively constant across all ages. As we decrease the number of local cases, right, so going down to say there's only one local case, we see that as individuals or younger individuals will have a lower proportion that are willing to seek vaccination, whereas for that same level of risk, right, in terms of local cases, that increases as one ages. And when there's no local cases at all, those who are youngest have the least number or least proportion willing to go get vaccinated. Another way that we can think about this is to just look at the actual local cases numbers and just hold fixed, say, an age. So say someone is age 30, we can see that, at 0 cases, we have a proportion that are willing to seek vaccination at about like 45 or so. And then if we increase the number of local cases to 1, right, now we're at almost 70. If we increase the number of local cases to 10, now we're at about 80. And as we go up to 100 cases, now we're at about 90, right? So there's much more of a shift, right? So someone who's in their 30s is going to be much more sensitive or change their willingness to vaccinate much more in terms of the change in risk compared to someone who is in their 70s, right? There is less movement as risk increases or decreases, right? The proportion willing to seek vaccination doesn't change quite as much, right? So that was the key idea behind vaccine propensity. We can represent this slightly differently. We can actually just put the local cases on the x-axis. So now we go from 0 local cases to 1 local case to 10 local cases up to 100. So here again, you can think of the x-axis now as representing that dial, right, that we're increasing the level of risk. And then on the y-axis, we still have the proportion seeking vaccination. And so as risk increases, you would expect that the proportion willing to seek vaccination would also increase. And that is, in fact, what we see. So here we're showing the difference between the morbidity and the mortality presentations. So the mortality is the square, and we can see that that's higher than the morbidity. So being presented with information about mortality, not surprisingly, spurs people to be more willing to vaccinate than information about morbidity. The most interesting result from my perspective is the one connected with political ideology. So again, here we're thinking about the x-axis as that risk dial. And what we did was look at 7 different categories of political leaning. So we have very liberal, liberal, slightly liberal, moderate, slightly conservative, conservative, and very conservative. And you'll notice that there's sort of 2 trends to pay attention to. On the one hand, as you increase risk, all of these groups tend to increase the proportion that are willing to go get vaccinated. Right? So whether you look at the very conservatives or the moderates or the liberals, right, we see generally an increase, a trend that increases. The other trend to sort of notice, and this is highlighted most clearly in the case where there's 1 local instance of the disease, is that very liberals, and so that side of the spectrum tends to be higher in terms of willingness to vaccinate, whereas as you move towards the conservative end of the spectrum, we see a decrease in terms of the number that are willing to get vaccinated relative to others that are provided with just 1 instance of the disease. And it should be clear, all of these, while these different spots are not on one, that's just us sort of spreading them out so you can see them, right? So all this whole cluster right here, I can perhaps annotate this real quick, right? These are all the same in terms of they were presented with the one local disease. We just moved it around for visualization purposes. Okay, so this is consistent with other research. That's to say, in a paper that we have that we also published in PLOS ONE, we found that despite the fact that there are a lot of individuals that form that are very, very liberal and are leading sort of like very sort of healthy lifestyles, or what they think is very healthy, right, by avoiding anything that is not organic, or they're not trying to put anything in their bodies, right? There are individuals who will avoid vaccination for those types of reasons. They do not make up as large of a group as those that lean more conservatively and are vaccine hesitant for some other reasons. Some of those are related to trust, which we've studied in the PLOS ONE paper. So our findings here are consistent with those findings. What I think is actually really interesting is to note the difference in the slope of these trends when we compare something like the ends of the spectrum versus the middle case, right, the moderates. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove the liberals, the slightly conservatives, and the conservatives, just to sort of illustrate what I have in mind. Oh. Sorry, I need to no longer annotate. There we go. Okay, so what I've done, we're just looking at the same plot now. I've just removed the in-between cases, and we're just looking at the sort of extremes ends of the political leaning spectrum. So that's the very liberal and the very conservative, and then looking at the moderates. So if we look at the very liberals and the very conservative, what we see is the same rough slope. So while there's a difference in the baseline in terms of how many are willing to get vaccinated at the 0 local cases risk level, the number of extra individuals who are going to get vaccinated as we increase the local cases is about the same for the very liberals and the very conservatives. So the base is a little bit different, but the number of individuals that increase from 0 to 1 is about the same for the very liberals and the very conservatives. And then again, when we go from 1 to 10 local cases, we see about the same jump as from 0 to 1 as from 1 to 10, right? So the rate is about the same. If we compare that or contrast that with the moderates, what we'll see is that for very low levels of risk, the moderates tend to be really similar to the conservatives in terms of the proportion that are willing to get vaccinated. But as we dial up the risk, by the time we get up to 100 local cases, their behaving or their willingness to vaccinate is more similar to the very liberals. So this is consistent with the idea that worldviews, as far as we can track worldviews by political ideology, can actually inform or have some impact on people's decision making. And moderates here, if we think of moderates as being less sort of entrenched or being less informed by their worldviews, specifically by sort of political ideology, they're more responsive to information coming from the world, right? So when the risk is really low, they tend to not be willing to go get vaccinated. But as risk gets higher, they're much more likely then to get vaccinated, right? Or more of them are willing to switch and change their minds. So there seems to be a difference in how moderates respond to risk information here presented in terms of local cases compared to how quickly or how sensitive very liberals and very conservatives are. So to summarize then, I should sort of take a step back and just point out that our timing is pure luck. The fact that we did this study with a new disease when we didn't know that COVID was coming was just pure chance. And there's some interesting questions that we're now asking, given that we now have an actual concrete example of a disease without yet having a vaccine for it, right, that is widely available. We can imagine trying to do something like the study again to see whether some of these predictions or some of these results bear out in the current context. The other thing I want to point out, just sort of taking a step back, is just the level of interdisciplinary effort that went on here. So we have someone like Ben Ridenhour, who has actually previously worked for the CDC, who really helped us sort of make some important distinctions between disease severity and disease risk, right? There's some nuances there, as well as Craig Miller, right? Thinking about how to model these types of things and how we should try to prompt people with certain questions in order to be able to get the type of information that we would be able to then use in our models. And then Juliet, who has done a lot of work on risk perception in political contexts. Florian Justwan, who has a lot of work and a lot of experience in doing survey methodology, as well as interest in political psychology and the notion of trust. And then myself, who just manages to have these great people work together. And then I'm also really interested in just decision making and trying to understand how social influence and worldviews impact people's decision making. So the key insight or the key sort of finding that I think is most interesting is that to the extent that political ideology is a way to tap into how worldviews can affect decisions, we see that happens in the case of vaccine decision making. So we know, given other literature, that happens in other contexts. And so now we see that actually has happened in the case of vaccines as well. In addition, and this is sort of hinting at the directions where we're taking some of this research now, political ideology can also be used as a way to signal social influence, right? So if you say, I'm part of this political orientation, I'm signaling to someone else, hey, you can either trust me or like we have something in common and it's acceptable for you to say certain things or it's acceptable for you to believe certain things. And so that can exert some type of social pressure as well. And so we're interested in how social influence can impact vaccination decisions. And we have some unpublished survey data that we collected during the 2019 measles outbreak, where we tried to tease apart some questions, not just related to political ideology, but specifically to social influence, where that might come from family or friends and various sources like social media. But because we haven't fully analyzed that yet, I'm not going to say anything about what those results look like yet. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that great introduction, Bert. And before I go to some very good questions waiting in the chat, I wondered if any of the other members of the team who are participating, whether Florian or Craig or Ben, if any of you would like to add a comment or provide some additional insights into your part of this very interesting study. And Bert, why don't you go ahead and stop the screen share and then we can see everyone's faces.
Sounds great.
So, any comments from any of the other presenters? And if give a wave or unmute yourself if you'd like. Well, why don't I go to the questions? And Dean Ginger Carney is asking, how did you get participants for the study? And I might follow that up if we could learn a little bit more about the methodology of how the interviews were conducted. So Florian, you want to tackle that one? Go ahead and unmute.
Yes, thank you. So we got the participants for the study by partnering with a survey research firm. So the firm that we decided to work with is called now Dynata, D-Y-N-A-T-A. It used to be called Survey Sampling International. So the way in which this firm basically operates is they are creating a pool of potential survey respondents in an online panel. And as a researcher, you then pay something between $4 and $5 for each respondent. And the survey firm will ensure that your final sample matches kind of certain quotas that you set up ahead of time. For our purposes, we looked at like 4 or 5 different variables, and we wanted to make sure that our final sample would match those. would match the known population distribution in the United States on those 4 or 5 major dimensions. So that's how we tackled the issue of respondent recruitment.
Professor James Foster is wondering, is there any way to say what level of vaccination for herd immunity would be in these scenarios? And second related question is, under what conditions will enough people seek vaccination that is or is not sufficient for herd immunity? And so I don't know if that's clearly outside the scope of your study, but if any of you would care to speculate about whether that would be a factor in people's decision to choose to get a vaccination.
Craig or Ben, I'll let you take that one if you want.
Are you with us, Ben? I mean, we did not, you know, the topic of herd immunity has to do with the ability of the virus or the pathogen to spread, right? How infectious it is, and also the immunity it confers, or how long the immunity lasts. And we didn't include those properties, correct, Bert? We didn't include those properties in our scenarios, and so correct. It really isn't something that was in the scope of this study. Now, if we think about the proportion of people who ultimately would be willing to vaccinate, it was between 80 and 90%, right, Bert? Which for most, and Ben, if you're on, jump in here, I would say that would confer herd immunity for many diseases and not all.
So yeah, I think I'll just back up what Craig said. I don't think that, you know, we didn't really include anything about herd immunity in here other than sort of the likelihood that you get infected. So it would be sort of hard to back that out to an actual level of herd immunity that would be required. And I also sort of think there's you know, a general lack of understanding of what herd immunity is, right? It's probably something that's just sort of entered into the zeitgeist of the US and other places with COVID, right? I think if you mentioned herd immunity when we ran this survey, people would be largely just confused by what you were talking. And I think they probably still would be confused by it, but anyway.
Other thoughts on herd immunity? I'm seeing a thumbs up from Professor Foster, so I think you answered his question. Nancy Cheney has placed a link to an article in The Lancet in the chat, mapping global trends in vaccine confidence and investigating barriers to vaccine uptake, a large-scale retrospective temporal modeling study. I just wondered if any of our presenters today are familiar with that work, and maybe you might help us distinguish between a retrospective modeling study and a prospective or a predictive study, such as you've done. Any thoughts on that?
I have not seen that paper, so thank you very much for bringing that to my attention. I will have to go have a look at that. And I'll let Craig or Ben answer the question about retrospective temporal modeling as opposed to prospective or predictive.
I can only sort of speculate about what was done here, but I imagine they took sort of historical data on vaccination and then looked at probably similar things to what we did. I'm not exactly sure in terms of like political leaning and things like that. Whatever the barriers are, they are, and tried to look for you know, correlations between uptake and those barriers. But again, I'm just sort of speculating here as to what they did.
I'm curious about the nature of your interdisciplinary cooperation. Did you have to establish a a common vocabulary between the various disciplines? Did you bounce a lot of ideas back and forth during the preliminary stages? Was there a challenge for you, Bert, as a philosopher, to understand some of the mathematical modeling that Ben was throwing out? Or just if all of you could just talk a little bit about the process.
Sorry, I'm being harassed by a cat right now.
That's another discipline to incorporate into the study.
I think I just need to give in and let him cuddle for a second.
So, Florian, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can at least give it a first stab. So it is interesting talking or working with faculty in, at times drastically different disciplines, that you have conversations that take a little while. And then after half an hour, you realize that three people in the room are using one term in very different contexts. So the one word where that I think has caused long conversations in our research group was the term model. Philosophers, people in biology, political scientists, I feel like we all use the term model in very particular and unique ways. And we take it for granted at times that this is how other people do it too. So it is interesting, working on these types of research projects that at times you don't even realize what types of phrases need to be defined with a common vocabulary when the research process gets going. At the same time, I'm just pointing to this because this is one of the challenges that I've personally experienced there in some of our conversations. It is amazing what creative research designs are possible when you have people with vastly different backgrounds. So I would argue that having read quite a few studies in this realm now, what we've put together for the purposes of the survey is a really, seems to be very different from a lot of the comparable papers in that literature. And I think, if I may say that, I think that we've done we've gone down a very creative route there. And I think this is largely due to the fact that we have this disciplinary diversity represented in our research team.
Other thoughts from any of the team?
I would just agree with what Florian said largely, but I wanted to give a shout out. Bert already mentioned it. This started from CMCI, which was, and IMCI now, but an effort to establish these collaborative groups. And we worked on a grant together, or actually several submissions of a grant for this work together. And, there was a lot of getting a common vocabulary, I think, and a lot of working through ideas from different disciplines, and it was a lot of fun. So,
yeah, I'll echo what Florian was just sort of suggesting. I do think that a lot of the research that we've done has been very creative and not necessarily tied to a specific way that it gets done in a certain discipline, right? A specific discipline often gives you some type of framework to work in, and then that often shapes the types of questions that you're then likely to ask. And I think, given our interests and the variety of backgrounds that we come from, we did not feel like we were tied to that. We were just like, let's just investigate the thing that we're interested in, and look at that question and not worry too much about whether that meets the standards of the methods that have to be done in that particular discipline. That does come at a cost. Not just in terms of discussions taking much longer because you're spending a lot of time coordinating the way that you're thinking about things, but it can also come at the cost of trying to figure out, when we're doing a grant proposal, how do we write this up, given that the people who are going to be reading it are coming from these various perspectives. And so, some people will want you to add a bunch of information about one thing, and other reviewers might want something else. And then also, as authors of the grant proposal, right, you might think that, we need to spend more time talking about this modeling component. Others will say, no, we need to spend more time talking about this other component, and there's only 12 pages in total. And so there is a lot of negotiating to do this. So it is a lot of fun, but it's not a joke. It is also a lot of work.
Bert, you mentioned that you have some unprocessed or unanalyzed data about attitudes towards measles vaccine. How soon do you hope to crunch those numbers and turn them into a publishable or presentable study? Or is that probably on the back burner till this project is done? But when are you hoping to go forward with that?
I can't believe I have an opportunity to call out Craig Miller on this, but Craig, would you like to answer that question? Because I think that's in on his desk right now.
Yeah, it's on my plate. It is work that we're doing right now, and the COVID modeling work that Ben and I have gotten deeply involved in has derailed this. But the analysis is half done. The paper is half written. So on the order of months, I'll be disappointed if we don't have a draft of this thing by Christmas.
Great. Well, something for us to look forward to. Professor Schofield from the history department has put a question in. She observes, I find it interesting that religiosity and geography did not end up being statistically important. She comments, in our public perception, both geography and religion are related to political identities. So did any of your research point to any association between these two factors and their influence on vaccine decisions? Or if you'd care to speculate on why they didn't show up as statistically significant.
If I remember correctly, when we were doing the model selection, I don't remember if we actually included geography or not. Ben, do you remember?
I don't think so, because all we got, because this was an online survey, all we had was the IP addresses for the people, right? And those are not reliable indicators of geography. Right. And so we didn't have that information, I don't think. Florian's raising his hand. Maybe he has something to add to that.
Yeah, so we had census region, which I'm pretty sure we did look at, and it didn't matter. And then the one thing that the one thing that we did is we had like a hometown population size or something like this, right? Which is a very rough indicator of someone's geographic location. So it's not necessarily which state they're in, but just how big is the community that they live in. And that, I believe, didn't really matter in the statistical analysis.
How about the religion aspect?
Yeah, I was going to say something about that. I think that could be that since those two things are correlated, like if religiosity and political leanings are correlated, right, then when you're doing the modeling, it's going to pick one of the two variables, and the one that has a stronger signal for explaining vaccine propensity, right? And so it could be that essentially what you're seeing is political leaning just trumping the religiosity in terms of importance of making a prediction there. And that correlation is being sort of washed out, I guess.
Yeah, there is now increasing evidence that from a lot of different studies that ideology really matters here. And because these two things, as Ben was pointing out, are so highly correlated, I think that's one of the major contributing factors there. About the other thing, the other geography question, there is some conflicting research about the effect of geography broadly defined on vaccine attitudes. So in a related project, in a related project about a year ago, we looked at what the effect is of one's proximity to a recent measles outbreak on willingness to vaccinate for that disease. And what we found there is that the proximity to a recent outbreak does matter, but it only matters for a small subsection of the electorates. And there are a few other studies that also seem to suggest that that geography might matter, but not for everyone to the same extent. And it's only certain subsets of the American population that are very sensitive to geographic considerations in their vaccine decision-making.
As we look forward to the hopeful prospect of COVID-19 coronavirus vaccine sometime in 2021, if we're lucky, do you think that your findings might be helpful to both the government agencies that would be overseeing a vaccination program, as well as to the vaccine manufacturers and testers? Would there be things that they would want to zero in on as they try to convince the public that vaccines are not only beneficial to individuals, but to the greater population as a whole? Any thoughts on how your results could be used to shape a public information or advocacy campaign?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, both in this work that we've done and in some previous work that I pointed out from Plus One, things like ideology and trust play a huge role in people's decision making about this. And so more and more people are beginning to recognize that just simply providing people with information is not going to be a reliable way of convincing people, that you need to also take into consideration where they're getting that information from. In previous studies, we have seen that someone's health practitioner, right, their family doctor, is someone that can typically, or is typically trusted and cuts through ideological considerations. Whereas if you expect some information coming from some government institutions, you can expect that to be taken up by some of the electorate, but not others. And that it could be sort of interpreted as being divisive. So one has to be very careful with the avenues through which the information gets presented. Florian, or I know Craig, you know, the two of you, we've talked about this a fair bit.
I mean, one thing I'll just chime in is that the measles work, one of the main things that we see in the measles work is that people who have chosen not to vaccinate their children are very sensitive to social cues, much more sensitive to social cues on this issue than people who have vaccinated. And so the social dynamic exerts an asymmetric and disproportionate effect on those who, in the case of measles, are not vaccinating. But I would expect that people who are very hesitant to vaccinate will also show that kind of social sensitivity. So that means that getting those people to vaccinate is going to be a social problem above and beyond everything else. That's what it suggests.
There's a follow-up in the chat from Nancy Cheney, who talks about the recent emphasis on speeding development and delivery of vaccines, combined with the political messages, either advocating or opposing getting the vaccine into the population, have introduced more skepticism, even among scientists. So if you did some future research, would there be a way to look at that element? Would you be able to measure skepticism by the public in response to the haste or care in which the vaccine was developed and tested? And I suppose that speaks to the trust issue that Bert mentioned earlier, but any thoughts on how we get past the inherent skepticism?
I think we would love to. Part of the biggest challenge right now is the time management, right? Between some of us doing high flex courses, which just take more time, and others being involved on the ground for the COVID modeling, it has become increasingly difficult to sort of find the time for all of us to collaborate to do this. I've spoken with Craig about this. We would love to do this, and with Florian as well. So that's really just me complaining about not having enough time. We really want to. So do we actually plan to? We don't know. I think that depends a lot on what the rest of the semester looks like, and what our relative sort of time constraints are going to be going forward.
Well, thank you for your work so far, and congratulations on how you've been able to analyze and comment and get these results distributed. I'd like to invite the audience to show your appreciation with either a clap symbol emoji, or if you're on screen, you could give a silent clap as well. So thank you for a truly interdisciplinary presentation that helped us better understand an important public health question. I hope you'll all come back next week when our topic is pandemic pedagogy in the performing arts, and we'll hear from faculty in music, theater, and dance. Again, thanks to our panelists today. Thanks for everyone for sticking with us through the changes in our delivery over this semester. And stay home, stay out of the smoke, and stay safe.